The Marvelous Land of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 12. Mr. H. M. Wogglebug, T.E. Now, General Ginger, who, you will remember, commanded the army of revolt, was rendered very uneasy by the escape of the Scarecrow from the Emerald City. She feared, and with good reason, that if His Majesty and the Tin Woodman joined forces, it would mean danger to her and her entire army, for the people of Oz had not yet forgotten the deeds of those famous heroes who had passed successfully through so many startling adventures. So Ginger sent post-haste for old Mombi the Witch, and promised her large rewards if she would come to the assistance of the rebel army. Mombi was furious at the trick Tip had played upon her, as well as at his escape and the theft of the precious Powder of Life, so she needed no urging to induce her to travel to the Emerald City to assist Ginger in defeating the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman, who had made Tip one of their friends. Mombi had no sooner arrived at the royal palace than she discovered, by means of her secret magic, that the adventurers were starting upon their journey to the Emerald City. So she retired to a small room high up in a tower, and locked herself in while she practiced such arts as she could command to prevent the return of the Scarecrow and his companions. That was why the Tin Woodman presently stopped and said, "Something very curious has happened. I ought to know by heart and every step of this journey, yet I fear we have lost our way." "That is quite impossible," protested the Scarecrow. "Why do you think, my dear friend, that we have gone astray? Why, here before us is a great field of sunflowers, and I never saw this field before in my life." At these words they all looked around, only to find that they were indeed surrounded by a field of tall stalks, every stalk bearing at its top a gigantic sunflower. And not only were these flowers almost blinding in their vivid hues of red and gold, but each one whirled around upon its stalk like a miniature windmill, completely dazzling the vision of the beholders, and so mystifying them that they knew not which way to turn. "It's witchcraft!" exclaimed Tip. While they paused, hesitating and wondering, the Tin Woodman uttered a cry of impatience and advanced with swinging axe to cut down the stalks before him. But now the sunflowers suddenly stopped their rapid whirling, and the travelers plainly saw a girl's face appear in the center of each flower. These lovely faces looked upon the astonished band with mocking smiles, and then burst into a chorus of merry laughter at the dismay their appearance caused. "Stop! Stop!" cried Tip, seizing the Woodman's arm. "They're alive! They're girls!" At that moment the flowers began whirling again, and the faces faded away and were lost in the rapid revolutions. The Tin Woodman dropped his axe and sat down upon the ground. "It would be heartless to chop down those pretty creatures," said he despondently, "and yet I do not know how else we can proceed upon our way." "They look to me strangely like the faces of the army of revolt," mused the Scarecrow, "but I cannot conceive how the girls could have followed us here so quickly." "I believe it's magic," said Tip positively, "and that someone is playing a trick upon us. I've known old Mombi do things like that before. Probably it's nothing more than an illusion, and there are no sunflowers here at all." "Then let us shut our eyes and walk forward," suggested the Woodman. "Excuse me," replied the Scarecrow. "My eyes are not painted to shut. Because you happen to have 10 eyelids, you must not imagine we are all built in the same way." "And the eyes of the Sawhorse are not eyes," said Jack, leaning forward to examine them. "Nevertheless, you must ride quickly forward," commanded Tip, "and we will follow after you and so try to escape. My eyes are already so dazzled that I can scarcely see." So the Pumpkinhead rode boldly forward, and Tip grasped the stub tail of the Sawhorse and followed with closed eyes. The Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman brought up the rear, and before they had gone many yards, a joyful shout from Jack announced that the way was clear before them. They all paused to look backward. Not a trace of the field of sunflowers remained. More cheerfully now, they proceeded upon their journey, but old Mombi had so changed the appearance of the landscape that they would surely have been lost had not the Scarecrow wisely concluded to take their direction from the sun, for no witchcraft could change the course of the sun, and it was therefore a safe guide. However, other difficulties lay before them. The Sawhorse stepped into a rabbit hole and fell to the ground. The Pumpkinhead was pitched high into the air, and his history would probably have ended at that exact moment had not the Tin Woodman skillfully caught the pumpkin as it descended and saved it from injury. Tip soon had it fitted to the neck again and replaced Jack upon his feet. But the Sawhorse did not escape so easily, for when his leg was pulled from the rabbit hole, it was found to be broken short off and must be replaced or repaired before he could go a step farther. "This is quite serious," said the Tin Woodman. "If there were trees nearby, I might soon manufacture another leg for this animal, but I cannot see even a shrub for miles around. And there are neither fences nor houses in this part of the Land of Oz," added the Scarecrow disconsolately. "Then what shall we do?" inquired the boy. "I suppose I must start my brains working," replied His Majesty the Scarecrow, "for experience has taught me that I can do anything if I but take time to think it out." "Let us all think," said Tip, "and perhaps we shall find a way to repair the Sawhorse." So they sat in a row upon the grass and began to think, while the Sawhorse occupied itself by gazing curiously upon its broken limb. "Does it hurt?" asked the Tin Woodman in a soft, sympathetic voice. "Not in the least," returned the Sawhorse, "but my pride is injured to find that my anatomy is so brittle." For a time the little group remained in silent thought. Presently the Tin Woodman raised his head and looked over the fields. "What sort of creature is that which approaches us?" he asked wonderingly. The others followed his gaze and discovered coming toward them the most extraordinary object they had ever beheld. It advanced quickly and noiselessly over the soft grass, and in a few minutes stood before the adventurers and regarded them with an astonishment equal to their own. The Scarecrow was calm under all circumstances. "Good morning," he said politely. The stranger removed his hat with a flourish, bowed very low, and then responded, "Good morning, one and all. I hope you are, as an aggregation, enjoying excellent health. Permit me to present my card." With this courteous speech, it extended a card toward the Scarecrow, who accepted it, turned it over and over, and handed it with a shake of his head to Tip. The boy read aloud, "Mr. H. M. Wogglebug, T.E." "Dear me!" ejaculated the Pumpkinhead, staring somewhat intently. "How very peculiar," said the Tin Woodman. Tip's eyes were round and wondering, and the Sawhorse uttered a sigh and turned away its head. "Are you really a Wogglebug?" inquired the Scarecrow. "Most certainly, my dear sir," answered the stranger briskly.
"Is not my name upon the card?"
"It is," said the Scarecrow. "But may I ask what H.M. stands for?"
"H.M. means highly magnified,"
returned the Woggle-Bug proudly. "Oh, I see." The Scarecrow viewed the stranger critically. "And are you in truth highly magnified?"
"Sir,"
said the Woggle-Bug,
"I take you for a gentleman of judgment and discernment. Does it not occur to you that I am several thousand times greater than any Woggle-Bug you ever saw before? Therefore it is plainly evident that I am highly magnified, and there is no good reason why you should doubt the fact."
"Pardon me," returned the Scarecrow. "My brains are slightly mixed since I was last laundered. Would it be improper for me to ask also what the T.E. at the end of your name stands for?"
"Those letters express my degree,"
answered the Woggle-Bug with a condescending smile.
"To be more explicit, the initials mean that I am thoroughly educated."
"Oh," said the Scarecrow, much relieved. Tip had not yet taken his eyes off this wonderful personage. What he saw was a great round bug-like body supported upon two slender legs, which ended in delicate feet, the toes curling upward. The body of the Woggle-Bug was rather flat, and, judging from what could be seen of it, was of a glistening dark brown color upon the back, while the front was striped with alternate bands of light brown and white, blending together at the edges. Its arms were fully as slender as its legs, and upon a rather long neck was perched its head, not unlike the head of a man, except that its nose ended in a curling antenna or feeler, and its ears from the upper points bore antennae that decorated the sides of its head like two miniature curling pigtails. It must be admitted that the round black eyes were rather bulging in appearance, but the expression upon the Woggle-Bug's face was by no means unpleasant. For dress, the insect wore a dark blue swallow-tail coat, with a yellow silk lining and a flower in the buttonhole, a vest of white duck that stretched tightly across the wide body, knickerbockers of fawn-colored plush, fastened at the knees with gilt buckles, and perched upon its small head was jauntily set a tall silk hat. Standing upright before our amazed friends, the Woggle-Bug appeared to be fully as tall as the Tin Woodman, and surely no bug in all the land of Oz had ever before attained so enormous a size. "I confess," said the Scarecrow, "that your abrupt appearance has caused me surprise, and no doubt has startled my companions. I hope, however, that this circumstance will not distress you. We shall probably get used to you in time."
"Do not apologize, I beg of you,"
returned the Woggle-Bug earnestly.
"It affords me great pleasure to surprise people, for surely I cannot be classed with ordinary insects, and am entitled to both curiosity and admiration from those I meet."
"You are indeed," agreed His Majesty.
"If you will permit me to seat myself in your august company,"
continued the stranger,
"I will gladly relate my history, so that you will be better able to comprehend my unusual, may I say, remarkable appearance."
"You may say what you please," answered the Tin Woodman briefly. So the Woggle-Bug sat down upon the grass, facing the little group of wanderers, and told them the following story. Chapter 13. A Highly Magnified History.
It is but honest that I should acknowledge at the beginning of my recital that I was born an ordinary woggle-bug,
began the creature in a frank and friendly tone.
knowing no better. I used my arms as well as my legs for walking, and crawled under the edges of stones or hid among the roots of grasses, with no thought beyond finding a few insects smaller than myself to feed upon. The chill nights rendered me stiff and motionless, for I wore no clothing. But each morning the warm rays of the sun gave me new life, and restored me to activity. A horrible existence is this, but you must remember, it is the regular ordained existence of woggle-bugs, as well as many other tiny creatures that inhabit the earth. But destiny had singled me out, humble though I was, for a grander fate. One day I crawled near to a country schoolhouse, and my curiosity being excited by the monotonous hum of the students within, I made bold to enter and creep along a crack between two boards, until I reached the far end, where in front of a hearth by glowing embers sat the master at his desk. No one noticed so small a creature as a woggle-bug, and when I found that the hearth was even warmer and more comfortable than the sunshine, I resolved to establish my future home beside it. So I found a charming nest between two bricks, and hid myself therein for many, many months. Professor Know-it-all is doubtless the most famous scholar in the land of Oz, and after a few days I began to listen to the lectures and discourses he gave his pupils. Not one of them were more attentive than the humble, unnoticed woggle-bug, and I acquired in this way a fund of knowledge that I will myself confess is simply marvelous. That is why I place T.E., thoroughly educated, upon my cards, for my greatest pride lies in the fact that the world cannot produce another woggle-bug with a 10th part of my own culture and erudition.
"I do not blame you," said the Scarecrow. "Education is a thing to be proud of. I'm educated myself. The mess of brains given me by the great wizard is considered by my friends to be unexcelled." "Nevertheless," interrupted the Tin Woodman, "a good heart is, I believe, much more desirable than education or brains." "To me," said the Sawhorse, "a good leg is more desirable than either." "Could seeds be considered in the light of brains?" inquired the Pumpkinhead abruptly. "Keep quiet," commanded Tip sternly. "Very well, dear father," answered the obedient Jack. The Woggle-Bug listened patiently, even respectfully, to these remarks, and then resumed his story.
I must have lived fully 3 years in that secluded schoolhouse hearth,
said he,
drinking thirstily at the ever-flowing fount of limpid knowledge before me.
"Quite poetical," commented the Scarecrow, nodding his head approvingly.
But one day, continued the Bug, a marvelous circumstance occurred that altered my very existence and brought me to my present pinnacle of greatness. The Professor discovered me in the act of crawling across the hearth, and, before I could escape, he had caught me between his thumb and forefinger.
"My dear children," said he. "I have captured a woggle-bug, a very rare and interesting specimen. Do any of you know what a woggle-bug is?" "No!" yelled the scholars in chorus. "Then," said the professor, "I will get out my famous magnifying glass and throw the insect upon a screen in a highly magnified condition, that you may all study carefully its peculiar construction and become acquainted with its habits and manner of life."
He then brought from a cupboard a most curious instrument, and before I could realize what had happened, I found myself thrown upon a screen in a highly magnified state, even as you now behold me. The students stood up on their stools and craned their heads forward to get a better view of me, and two little girls jumped upon the sill of an open window, where they could see me more plainly.
"Behold!" cried the professor in a loud voice, "this highly magnified woggle-bug, one of the most curious insects in existence."
Being thoroughly educated, and knowing what is required of a cultured gentleman, at this juncture I stood upright, and placing my hand upon my bosom, made a very polite bow. My action, being unexpected, must have startled them, for one of the little girls perched upon the window-sill gave a scream, and fell backwards out of the window, drawing her companion with her as she disappeared. The professor uttered a cry of horror, and rushed away through the door to see if the poor children were injured by the fall. The scholars followed after him in a wild mob, and I was left alone in the schoolroom, still in a highly magnified state, and free to do as I pleased. It immediately occurred to me that this was a good opportunity to escape. I was proud of my great size, and realized that now I could safely travel anywhere in the world, while my superior culture would make me a fit associate for the most learned person I might chance to meet. So, while the professor picked the little girls, who were more frightened than hurt, off the ground, and the pupils clustered around him, closely grouped, I calmly walked out of the schoolhouse, turned a corner, and escaped unnoticed to a grove of trees that stood near.
"Wonderful!" exclaimed the Pumpkinhead admiringly.
It was, indeed,
agreed the Woggle-Bug.
I have never ceased to congratulate myself for escaping while I was highly magnified, for even my excessive knowledge would have proved of little use to me had I remained a tiny, insignificant insect.
"I didn't know before," said Tip, looking at the Woggle-Bug with a puzzled expression, "that insects wore clothes."
"Nor do they in their natural state,"
returned the stranger.
"but in the course of my wanderings I had the good fortune to save the 9th life of a tailor. Tailors having, like cats, 9 lives, as you probably know. The fellow was exceedingly grateful, for had he lost his 9th life, it would have been the end of him. So he begged permission to furnish me with the stylish costume I now wear. It fits very nicely, does it not?"
And the Woggle-Bug stood up and turned himself around slowly, so that all might examine his person. "He must have been a good tailor," said the Scarecrow somewhat enviously. "He was a good-hearted tailor at any rate," observed Nick Chopper. "But where were you going when you met us?" Tip asked the Woggle-Bug.
"Nowhere in particular,"
was the reply.
"although it is my intention soon to visit the Emerald City and arrange to give a course of lectures to select audiences on the advantages of magnification."
"We are bound for the Emerald City now," said the Tin Woodman. "So if it pleases you to do so, you are welcome to travel in our company." The Woggle-Bug bowed with profound grace.
"It will give me great pleasure,"
said he,
"to accept your kind invitation, for nowhere in the land of Oz could I hope to meet with so congenial a company."
"That is true," acknowledged the Pumpkinhead. "We are quite as congenial as flies and honey."
"But pardon me if I seem inquisitive. Are you not all rather unusual?"
asked the Woggle-Bug, looking from one to another with unconcerned interest. "No more so than yourself," answered the Scarecrow. "Everything in life is unusual until you get accustomed to it."
"What rare philosophy!"
exclaimed the Woggle-Bug admiringly. "Yes, my brains are working well today," admitted the Scarecrow, an accent of pride in his voice.
"Then, if you are sufficiently rested and refreshed, let us bend our legs toward the Emerald City,"
suggested the Magnified One. "We can't," said Tip. "The Sawhorse has broken a leg, so he can't bend his steps. And there is no wood around to make him a new limb from, and we can't leave the horse behind, because the Pumpkinhead is so stiff in his joints that he has to ride."
"How very unfortunate!"
cried the Woggle-Bug. Then he looked the party over carefully and said,
"If the Pumpkinhead is to ride, why not use one of his legs to make a leg for the horse that carries him? I judge that both are made of wood."
"Now that is what I call cleverness," said the Scarecrow approvingly. "I wonder my brains did not think of that long ago. Get to work, my dear Nick, and fit the Pumpkinhead's leg to the Sawhorse." Jack was not especially pleased with this idea, but he submitted to having his left leg amputated by the Tin Woodman, and whittled down to fit the left leg of the Sawhorse. Nor was the Sawhorse especially pleased with the operation either, for he growled a good deal about being butchered, as he called it, and afterward declared that the new leg was a disgrace to a respectable Sawhorse. "I beg you to be more careful in your speech," said the Pumpkinhead sharply. "Remember, if you please, that it is my leg you are abusing." "I can't forget it," retorted the Sawhorse, "for it is quite as flimsy as the rest of your person." "Flimsy? Me? Flimsy?" cried Jack in a rage. "How dare you call me flimsy?" "Because you are built as absurdly as a jumping jack," sneered the horse, rolling his knotty eyes in a vicious manner. "Even your head won't stay straight, and you never can tell whether you are looking backwards or forwards." "Friends, I entreat you not to quarrel," pleaded the Tin Woodman anxiously. "As a matter of fact, we are none of us above criticism, so let us bear with each other's faults."
"An excellent suggestion,"
said the Woggle-Bug approvingly.
"You must have an excellent heart, my metallic friend."
"I have," returned Nick, well pleased. "My heart is quite the best part of me, but now let us start upon our journey." They perched the one-legged Pumpkinhead upon the Sawhorse, and tied him to his seat with cords, so that he could not possibly fall off, and then, following the lead of the Scarecrow, they all advanced in the direction of the Emerald City. Chapter 14. Old Mombi Indulges in Witchcraft. They soon discovered that the Sawhorse limped, for his new leg was a trifle too long. So they were obliged to halt while the Tin Woodman chopped it down with his axe, after which the wooden steed paced along more comfortably. But the Sawhorse was not entirely satisfied even yet. "It was a shame that I broke my other leg," it growled.
On the contrary,
Airily remarked the Woggle-Bug, who was walking alongside,
you should consider the accident most fortunate, for a horse is never of much use until he has been broken.
"I beg your pardon," said Tip, rather provoked, for he felt a warm interest in both the Sawhorse and his man Jack. "But permit me to say that your joke is a poor one, and as old as it is poor,"
Still, it is a joke,
declared the Woggle-Bug firmly.
and a joke derived from a play upon words is considered among educated people to be eminently proper.
"What does that mean?" inquired the Pumpkinhead stupidly.
It means, my dear friend,
Explained the Woggle-Bug,
that our language contains many words having a double meaning, and that to pronounce a joke that allows both meanings of a certain word proves the joker a person of culture and refinement, who has, moreover, a thorough command of the language.
"I don't believe that," said Tip plainly. "Anybody can make a pun."
Not so,
rejoined the Woggle-Bug stiffly.
it requires education of a high order. Are you educated, young sir?
"Not especially," admitted Tip.
Then you cannot judge the matter. I myself am thoroughly educated, and I say that puns display genius. For instance, were I to ride upon this Sawhorse, he would not only be an animal, he would become an equipage, for he would then be a horse and buggy.
At this the Scarecrow gave a gasp, and the Tin Woodman stopped short and looked reproachfully at the Woggle-Bug. At the same time the Sawhorse loudly snorted his derision, and even the Pumpkinhead put up his hand to hide the smile which, because it was carved upon his face, he could not change to a frown. But the Woggle-Bug strutted along as if he had made some brilliant remark, and the Scarecrow was obliged to say, "I have heard, my dear friend, that a person can become over-educated, and although I have a high respect for brains, no matter how they may be arranged or classified, I begin to suspect that yours are slightly tangled. In any event, I must beg you to restrain your superior education while in our society. We are not very particular," added the Tin Woodman, "and we are exceedingly kind-hearted, but if your superior culture gets leaky again—" He did not complete the sentence, but he twirled his gleaming axe so carelessly that the Woggle-Bug looked frightened and shrank away to a safe distance. The others marched on in silence, and the highly magnified one, after a period of deep thought, said in a humble voice,
I will endeavor to restrain myself.
"That is all we can expect," returned the Scarecrow pleasantly, and good nature being thus happily restored to the party, they proceeded upon their way. When they again stopped to allow Tip to rest, the boy being the only one that seemed to tire, the Tin Woodman noticed many small round holes in the grassy meadow. "This must be a village of the field mice," he said to the Scarecrow. "I wonder if my old friend, the Queen of the Mice, is in this neighborhood." "If she is, she may be of great service to us," answered the Scarecrow, who was impressed by a sudden thought. "See if you can call her, my dear Nick." So the Tin Woodman blew a shrill note upon a silver whistle that hung around his neck, and presently a tiny gray mouse popped from a nearby hole and advanced fearlessly toward them. for the Tin Woodman had once saved her life, and the Queen of the Field Mice knew he was to be trusted. "Good day, your Majesty," said Nick, politely addressing the mouse. "I trust you are enjoying good health." "Thank you, I am quite well," answered the Queen demurely, as she sat up and displayed the tiny golden crown upon her head. "Can I do anything to assist my old friend?" "You can indeed," replied the Scarecrow eagerly. "Let me, I entreat you, take a dozen of your subjects with me to the Emerald City." "Will they be injured in any way?" asked the Queen doubtfully. "I think not," replied the Scarecrow. "I will carry them hidden in the straw which stuffs my body, and when I give them the signal by unbuttoning my jacket, they have only to rush out and scamper home again as fast as they can. By doing this they will assist me to regain my throne, which the army of revolt has taken from me." "In that case," said the Queen, "I will not refuse your request. Whenever you are ready, I will call 12 of my most intelligent subjects." "I am ready now," returned the Scarecrow. Then he lay flat upon the ground and unbuttoned his jacket, displaying the mass of straw with which he was stuffed. The Queen uttered a little piping call, and in an instant a dozen pretty field mice had emerged from their holes and stood before their ruler awaiting her orders. What the Queen said to them none of our travelers could understand, for it was in the mouse language, but the field mice obeyed without hesitation, running one after the other to the Scarecrow and hiding themselves in the straw of his breast. When all of the 12 mice had thus concealed themselves, the Scarecrow buttoned his jacket securely, and then arose and thanked the Queen for her kindness. "One thing more you might do to serve us," suggested the Tin Woodman, "and that is to run ahead and show us the way to the Emerald City, for some enemy is evidently trying to prevent us from reaching it." "I will do that gladly," returned the Queen. "Are you ready?" The Tin Woodman looked at Tip. "I'm rested," said the boy. "Let us start." Then they resumed their journey, the little gray Queen of the Field Mice running swiftly ahead, and then pausing until the travelers drew near, when away she would dart again. Without this unerring guide, the Scarecrow and his comrades might never have gained the Emerald City, for many were the obstacles thrown in their way by the arts of old Mombi. Yet not one of the obstacles really existed. All were cleverly contrived deceptions, for when they came to the banks of a rushing river that threatened to bar their way, the little Queen kept steadily on, passing through the seeming flood in safety, and our travelers followed her without encountering a single drop of water. Again a high wall of granite towered high above their heads and opposed their advance, but the gray field mouse walked straight through it, and the others did the same, the wall melting into mist as they passed it. Afterward, when they stopped for a moment to allow Tip to rest, they saw 40 roads branching off from their feet in 40 different directions, and soon these 40 roads began whirling around like a mighty wheel, first in one direction and then in the other, completely bewildering their vision. But the Queen called for them to follow her, and darted off in a straight line, and when they had gone a few paces the whirling pathways vanished and were seen no more. Mombi's last trick was the most fearful of all. She sent a sheet of crackling flame rushing over the meadow to consume them, and for the first time the Scarecrow became afraid and turned to fly. "If that fire reaches me, I will be gone in no time," said he, trembling until his straw rattled. "It's the most dangerous thing I ever encountered." "I'm off too," cried the Sawhorse, turning and prancing with agitation, "for my wood is so dry it would burn like kindlings." "Is fire dangerous to pumpkins?" asked Jack fearfully.
"You'll be baked like a tart, and so will I," answered the Woggle-Bug.
getting down on all fours so he could run the faster. But the Tin Woodman, having no fear of fire, averted the stampede by a few sensible words. "Look at the field mouse!" he shouted. "The fire does not burn her in the least. In fact, it is no fire at all, but only a deception." Indeed, to watch the little queen march calmly through the advancing flames restored courage to every member of the party, and they followed her without being even scorched.
"This is surely a most extraordinary adventure,"
said the Woggle-Bug, who was greatly amazed.
"For it upsets all the natural laws that I heard Professor Know-it-all teach in the schoolhouse."
"Of course it does," said the Scarecrow wisely. "All magic is unnatural, and for that reason is to be feared and avoided. But I see before us the gates of the Emerald City, so I imagine we have now overcome all the magical obstacles that seem to oppose us." Indeed, the walls of the city were plainly visible, and the Queen of the Field Mice, who had guided them so faithfully, came near to bid them good-bye. "We are very grateful to your Majesty for your kind assistance," said the Tin Woodman, bowing before the pretty creature. "I am always pleased to be of service to my friends," answered the Queen, and in a flash she had darted away upon her journey home. Chapter 15. The Prisoners of the Queen. Approaching the gateway to the Emerald City, the travelers found it guarded by two girls of the Army of Revolt, who opposed their entrance by drawing the knitting needles from their hair and threatening to prod the first that came near. But the Tin Woodman was not afraid. "At worst they can but scratch my beautiful nickel plate," he said. "But there will be no worst, for I think I can manage to frighten these absurd soldiers very easily. Follow me closely, all of you." Then, swinging his axe in a great circle to right and left before them, he advanced upon the gate, and the others followed him without hesitation. The girls, who had expected no resistance whatever, were terrified by the sweep of the glittering axe, and fled screaming into the city, so that our travelers passed the gates in safety and marched down the green marble pavement of the wide street toward the royal palace. "At this rate we will soon have your Majesty upon the throne again," said the Tin Woodman, laughing at his easy conquest of the guards. "Thank you, friend Nick," returned the Scarecrow gratefully. "Nothing can resist your kind heart and your sharp axe." As they passed the rows of houses, they saw through the open doors that men were sweeping and dusting and washing dishes, while the women sat around in groups, gossiping and laughing. "What has happened?" the Scarecrow asked a sad-looking man with a bushy beard, who wore an apron and was wheeling a baby carriage along the sidewalk.
"Why, we've had a revolution, your Majesty, as you ought to know very well,"
replied the man.
"and since you went away, the women have been running things to suit themselves. Oh, I'm glad you have decided to come back and restore order, for doing housework and minding the children is wearing out the strength of every man in the Emerald City."
Said the Scarecrow thoughtfully. "If it is such hard work as you say, how did the women manage it so easily?"
"Oh, I really do not know,"
replied the man with a deep sigh. "Perhaps the women are made of cast iron." No movement was made as they passed along the street to oppose their progress. Several of the women stopped their gossip long enough to cast curious looks upon our friends, but immediately they would turn away with a laugh or a sneer and resume their chatter. And when they met with several girls belonging to the Army of Revolt, those soldiers, instead of being alarmed or appearing surprised, merely stepped out of the way and allowed them to advance without protest. This action rendered the Scarecrow uneasy. "I'm afraid we are walking into a trap," said he. "Nonsense," returned Nick Chopper confidently. "These silly creatures are conquered already." But the Scarecrow shook his head in a way that expressed doubt, and Tip said, "It's too easy altogether. Look out for trouble ahead." "I will," returned his Majesty. Unopposed, they reached the royal palace and marched up the royal steps, which had once been thickly crusted with emeralds, but were now filled with tiny holes where the jewels had been ruthlessly torn from their settings by the army of revolt. And so far, not a rebel barred their way. Through the arched hallways and into the magnificent throne room marched the Tin Woodman and his followers, and here, when the green silken curtains fell behind them, they saw a curious sight. Seated within the glittering throne was General Ginger, with the Scarecrow's second-best crown upon her head and the royal scepter in her right hand. A box of caramels, from which she was eating, rested in her lap, and the girl seemed entirely at ease in her royal surroundings. The Scarecrow stepped forward and confronted her, while the Tin Woodman leaned upon his axe, and the others formed a half-circle back of his Majesty's person. "How dare you sit in my throne?" demanded the Scarecrow, sternly eyeing the intruder. "Don't you know you are guilty of treason, and that there is a law against treason?" "The throne belongs to whoever is able to take it," answered Ginger, as she slowly ate another caramel. "I have taken it, as you see, so just now I am the queen, and all who oppose me are guilty of treason and must be punished by the law you have just mentioned." This view of the case puzzled the Scarecrow. "How is it, friend Nick?" he asked, turning to the Tin Woodman. "Why, when it comes to law, I have nothing to say," answered that personage, "for laws were never meant to be understood, and it is foolish to make the attempt." "Then what shall we do?" asked the Scarecrow in dismay.
Why don't you marry the queen, and then you can both rule?"
suggested the Woggle-Bug. Ginger glared at the insect fiercely. "Why don't you send her back to her mother, where she belongs?" asked Jack Pumpkinhead. Ginger frowned. "Why don't you shut her up in a closet until she behaves herself and promises to be good?" inquired Tip. Ginger's lip curled scornfully. "Or give her a good shaking?" asked the Sawhorse. "No," said the Tin Woodman. "We must treat the poor girl with gentleness. Let us give her all the jewels she can carry and send her away happy and contented." At this Queen Ginger laughed aloud, and the next minute clapped her pretty hands together thrice as if for a signal. "You are very absurd creatures," said she, "but I am tired of your nonsense and have no time to bother with you longer." While the monarch and his friends listened in amazement to this impudent speech, a startling thing happened. The Tin Woodman's axe was snatched from his grasp by some person behind him, and he found himself disarmed and helpless. At the same time a shout of laughter rang in the ears of the devoted band, and turning to see whence this came, they found themselves surrounded by the army of revolt, the girls bearing in either hand their glistening knitting needles. The entire throne room seemed to be filled with rebels, and the Scarecrow and his comrades realized that they were prisoners. "You see how foolish it is to oppose a woman's wit," said Ginger gaily, "and this event only proves that I am more fit to rule the Emerald City than a Scarecrow. I bear you no ill will, I assure you, but lest you should prove troublesome to me in the future, I shall order you all to be destroyed. That is, all except the boy, who belongs to old Mombi and must be restored to her keeping. The rest of you are not human, and therefore it will not be wicked to demolish you." The sawhorse and the pumpkin-head's body I will have chopped up for kindling wood, and the pumpkins shall be made into tarts. The Scarecrow will do nicely to start a bonfire, and the Tin Man can be cut into small pieces and fed to the goats. As for this immense woggle-bug—"
"Highly magnified, if you please,"
interrupted the insect. "I think I will ask the cook to make a green turtle soup of you," continued the Queen reflectively. The woggle-bug shuddered. "Or if that won't do, we might use you for a Hungarian goulash, stewed and highly spiced," she added cruelly. The program of extermination was so terrible that the prisoners looked upon one another in a panic of fear. The Scarecrow alone did not give way to despair. He stood quietly before the Queen, and his brow was wrinkled in deep thought as he strove to find some means to escape. While thus engaged, he felt the straw within his breast move gently. At once his expression changed from sadness to joy, and, raising his hand, he quickly unbuttoned the front of his jacket. This action did not pass unnoticed by the crowd of girls clustering about him, but none of them suspected what he was doing until a tiny gray mouse leaped from his bosom to the floor and scampered away between the feet of the army of revolt. Another mouse quickly followed, then another and another, in rapid succession, and suddenly such a scream of terror went up from the army that it might easily have filled the stoutest heart with consternation. The flight that ensued turned to a stampede, and the stampede to a panic. For while the startled mice rushed wildly about the room, the Scarecrow had only time to note a whirl of skirts and a twinkling of feet as the girls disappeared from the palace, pushing and crowding one another in their mad efforts to escape. The Queen, at the first alarm, stood up on the cushions of the throne and began to dance frantically upon her tiptoes. Then a mouse ran up the cushions, and with a terrified leap poor Ginger shot clear over the head of the Scarecrow and escaped through an archway, never pausing in her wild career until she had reached the city gates. So, in less time than I can explain, the throne room was deserted by all save the Scarecrow and his friends, and the Woggle-Bug heaved a deep sigh of relief as he exclaimed,
"Oh, thank goodness we are saved."
"For a time, yes," answered the Tin Woodman, "but the enemy will soon return, I fear." "Let us bar all the entrances to the palace," said the Scarecrow. "Then we shall have time to think what is best to be done." So all except Jack Pumpkinhead, who was still tied fast to the Sawhorse, ran to the various entrances of the royal palace and closed the heavy doors, bolting and locking them securely. Then, knowing that the army of revolt could not batter down the barriers in several days, the adventurers gathered once more in the throne room for a council of war. Chapter 16. The Scarecrow Takes Time to Think. "It seems to me," began the Scarecrow, when all were again assembled in the throne room, "that the girl Ginger is quite right in claiming to be queen. And if she is right, then I am wrong, and we have no business to be occupying her palace."
"But you were the king until she came,"
said the Woggle-Bug, strutting up and down with his hands in his pockets.
"So it appears to me that she is the interloper instead of you."
"Especially as we have just conquered her and put her to flight," added the Pumpkinhead, as he raised his hands to turn his face toward the Scarecrow. "Have we really conquered her?" asked the Scarecrow quietly. "Look out the window and tell me what you see." Tip ran to the window and looked out. "The palace is surrounded by a double row of girl soldiers," he announced. "I thought so," returned the Scarecrow. "We are as truly their prisoners as we were before the mice frightened them from the palace." "My friend is right," said Nick Chopper, who had been polishing his breast with a bit of chamois leather. "Ginger is still the queen, and we are her prisoners." "But I hope she cannot get at us!" exclaimed the Pumpkinhead with a shiver of fear. "Oh, she threatened to make tarts of me, you know." "Don't worry," said the Tin Woodman. "It cannot matter greatly. If you stay shut up here, you will spoil in time anyway. A good tart is far more admirable than a decayed intellect." "Very true," agreed the Scarecrow. "Oh, dear," moaned Jack. "What an unhappy lot is mine! Why, dear father, did you not make me out of tin, or even out of straw, so that I would keep indefinitely?" "Shucks!" returned Tip indignantly. "You ought to be glad that I made you at all." Then he added reflectively, "Everything has to come to an end some time."
"But I beg to remind you,"
broke in the Woggle-Bug, who had a distressed look in his bulging round eyes,
"that this terrible queen, Ginger, suggested making a goulash of me. Me! The only highly magnified and thoroughly educated Woggle-Bug in the wide, wide world."
"I think it was a brilliant idea," remarked the Scarecrow approvingly. "Don't you imagine he would make a better soup?" asked the Tin Woodman, turning toward his friend. "Well, perhaps," acknowledged the Scarecrow. The Woggle-Bug groaned.
"Oh, I can see in my mind's eye,"
said he mournfully,
"the goats eating small pieces of my dear comrade the Tin Woodman, while my soup is being cooked on a bonfire built of the Sawhorse and Jack Pumpkinhead's body. Oh, and Queen Ginger watches me boil while she feeds the flames with my friend the Scarecrow."
This morbid picture cast a gloom over the entire party, making them restless and anxious. "It can't happen for some time," said the Tin Woodman, trying to speak cheerfully, "for we shall be able to keep Ginger out of this palace until she manages to break down the doors. And in the meantime I am liable to starve to death, and so is the Woggle-Bug," announced Tip.
"As for me,"
said the Woggle-Bug,
"I think that I shall live for some time on Jack Pumpkinhead. Not that I prefer pumpkins for food, but I believe they are somewhat nutritious, and Jack's head is large and plump."
"How heartless!" exclaimed the Tin Woodman, greatly shocked. "Are we cannibals, let me ask, or are we faithful friends? "I see very clearly that we cannot stay shut up in this palace," said the Scarecrow with decision. "So let us end this mournful talk and try to discover a means to escape." At this suggestion they all gathered eagerly around the throne, wherein was seated the Scarecrow, and as Tip sat down upon a stool, there fell from his pocket a pepper box, which rolled upon the floor. "What is this?" asked Nick Chopper, picking up the box. "Be careful!" cried the boy. "That's my powder of life. Don't spill it, for it is nearly gone." "And what is the powder of life?" inquired the Scarecrow, as Tip replaced the box carefully in his pocket. "It's some magical stuff old Mombi got from a crooked sorcerer," explained the boy. "She brought Jack to life with it, and afterward I used it to bring the Sawhorse to life. I guess it will make anything live that is sprinkled with it, but there's only about one dose left." "Then it is very precious," said the Tin Woodman. "Indeed it is," agreed the Scarecrow. "It may prove our best means of escape from our difficulties. I believe I will think for a few minutes, so I will thank you, friend Tip, to get out your little knife and rip this heavy crown from my forehead." Tip soon cut the stitches that had fastened the crown to the Scarecrow's head, and the former monarch of the Emerald City removed it with a sigh of relief, and hung it on a peg beside the throne. "Ah, that is my last memento of royalty," said he, "and I'm glad to get rid of it. The former king of this city, who was named Pastoria, lost the crown to the wonderful wizard, who passed it on to me. Now the girl Ginger claims it, and I sincerely hope it will not give her a headache." "A kindly thought which I greatly admire," said the Tin Woodman, nodding approvingly. "And now I will indulge in a quiet think," continued the Scarecrow, lying back in the throne. The others remained as silent and still as possible, so as not to disturb him, for all had great confidence in the extraordinary brains of the Scarecrow. And after what seemed a very long time indeed to the anxious watchers, the thinker got up, looked upon his friends with his most whimsical expression, and said, "My brains work beautifully today. I am quite proud of them. Now listen. If we attempt to escape through the doors of the palace, we shall surely be captured, and as we can't escape through the ground, there is only one other thing to be done. We must escape through the air." He paused to note the effect of these words, but all his hearers seemed puzzled and unconvinced. "The wonderful wizard escaped in a balloon," he continued. "We don't know how to make a balloon, of course, but any sort of thing that can fly through the air can carry us easily. So I suggest that my friend the Tin Woodman, who is a skilled mechanic, shall build some sort of a machine with good strong wings to carry us, and our friend Tip can then bring the thing to life with his magical powder." "Bravo!" cried Nick Chopper. "What splendid brains!" murmured Jack.
"Really quite clever,"
said the educated Woggle-Bug. "I believe it can be done," declared Tip. "That is, if the Tin Woodman is equal to making the thing." "I'll do my best," said Nick cheerily, "and as a matter of fact, I do not often fail in what I attempt. But the thing will have to be built on the roof of the palace, so it can rise comfortably into the air." "To be sure," said the Scarecrow. "Then let us search through the palace," continued the Tin Woodman, "and carry all the material we can find to the roof, where I will begin my work. First, however," said the Pumpkinhead, "I beg you will release me from this horse and make me another leg to walk with, for in my present condition I am of no use to myself or to anyone else." So the Tin Woodman knocked a mahogany center table to pieces with his axe, and fitted one of the legs, which was beautifully carved, onto the body of Jack Pumpkinhead, who was very proud of the acquisition. "It seems strange," said he, as he watched the Tin Woodman work, "that my left leg should be the most elegant and substantial part of me." "That proves you are unusual," returned the Scarecrow, "and I am convinced that the only people worthy of consideration in this world are the unusual ones, for the common folks are like the leaves of a tree and live and die unnoticed."
"Spoken like a philosopher,"
cried the Woggle-Bug, as he assisted the Tin Woodman to set Jack upon his feet. "How do you feel now?" asked Tip, watching the Pumpkinhead stump around to try his new leg. "As good as new," answered Jack joyfully, "and quite ready to assist you all to escape." "Then let us get to work," said the Scarecrow in a businesslike tone. So glad to be doing anything that might lead to the end of their captivity, the friends separated to wander over the palace in search of fitting material to use in the construction of their aerial machine.